Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coaches Corner University podcast. I am your host, Paul O'Need, and as usual, we are sponsored by Coaches Corner University. You can save $300 off of our education collective, which means you get lifetime access to our growing library of close to 150 hours of continuing education lectures for just $50. We're also sponsored by TC Nutrition, Barefoot Shoes, and Bacon and Barbells. You can find discount codes in the description below. Today, I am joined once again by Mr. Mike T. Nelson. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, buddy, how's it going?
I'm
Thank you for
doing
having me
well.
on.
Thank you for coming. I know there's, since the last time you were on, there's been a lot of things going on your end, primarily the Triphasic 2 book, which you co-wrote with Cal Dietz. You're going to pull it out?
Yeah, I even have it here. Look at that.
Ad plug. Yay. There you go. Boom.
Boom.
With a review of yours truly on the back.
Yes. Look at this on the back.
So I remember when Triphasic.
Yeah. That's awesome, buddy.
I remember when Triphasic first came out, it exploded onto the strength and conditioning scene, and it seemed like every single collegiate program was running some variation of Triphasic. Why rewrite the book?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There may be a new version of Triphasic 1 coming out, but there's no word on when that is. As of this recording, I'm not doing it. But this one took 9 years, so I don't know if I'm signing up for that. My wife will kill me. So the second one is actually all new material. So what we did is we had just a short overview of Triphasic 1. So if you didn't purchase Triphasic 1, I wouldn't say you need it to understand this one because it's different stuff. And we did do a short, 5-6 page overview of it. And we do have some comparisons of, the older Triphasic model to, say, the compressed Triphasic model and different things like that. What we wanted to do, because Triphasic 1 came out, over 10 years ago now, we wanted to update with all the other, techniques and everything else that have been going on since then. So the second one is actually 14 all new methods. So it's all new stuff since Triphasic 1. It's still based on those same principles. So if you have that book and you understand it, you'll probably be pretty easy to get into the next one. But I also wanted to make it also an entryway for more coaches to get into it who are new. Because as you know, right, better than anyone else, like, we tend to forget, being old people, that like there's a ton of turnover in the industry.
Yeah.
And that I wanted like a new entry point, because everybody wants the new sexy thing, which is great, and I understand why. But to give them stuff that, some of the stuff in the book Cal started doing 14 years ago. So it might be new in terms of print, but it's all, been around for a while. So they can get all the new stuff. They can be up to date on the entire systems. They'll get a basic of, Triphasic 1. And then if they really like it and they're like, oh man, I really want to go, hard down this rabbit hole, by all means, like, definitely pick up the first book.
Okay. So for those people who are not familiar with what Triphasic training is, can you give that brief overview, like Cole's notes of, what does triphasic mean?
Yeah, at its simplest level, we know that all lifting and all movements are triphasic, meaning they have 3 components. So if we take your favorite lift and say the squat, like when you walk the weight out, like as you go down, you're doing the eccentric, the lowering component. There's going to be a small isometric pause at the bottom, and there's going to be the concentric phase where you come back up to the top. Mm-hmm. So it has 3 phases: an eccentric, an isometric, and a concentric. And what Cal realized, like, God, I think this is like early 2001, 2002, possibly, that he's like, well, wait a minute, like, how come some of my athletes objectively squat the same amount of weight if we go just by pure 1RM limit strength, but some of them are better athletes than the other ones? So it wasn't necessarily about a pure 1RM strength. And again, these are athletes who are already strong. They're squatting 365, 405, 315 fast, whatever number you want to assume. They're not just out there, squatting the bar for the first time.
Right.
He's like, well, what's the difference? And so he started using a bunch of force plates and a bunch of measurements. And what he found was that his elite or his high-level athletes, they could come down and do the eccentric portion much faster. They could stop the load faster. And the concentric, coming up with the load, was much faster. He's like, oh, so when I plot it out, it looks more like this V-shaped. The athletes who were not as good had this more U. Took them much longer to get down to the bottom. They had a much more longer protracted isometric phase, and the concentric phase was slower.
Okay.
So it's like, oh, okay, cool. So now we can see what the difference is. Oh, wait a minute, but how do we train that? So he tried a bunch of different stuff. And what he finally realized was that if you take the components of the lift and you emphasize them in training, kind of like a bastardized block periodization thing, then when you put them back together, you got a much better result. And so initially he played with, doing isometric first because that was kind of all the rage at the time, and then doing concentric first. And what he realized was that if you did a block of, say, 2 weeks of just really hammering that eccentric phase, maybe going heavier, making it longer, just putting more overload on that eccentric phase, and then did about 2 weeks ish of the isometric phase. So go to the bottom, come up just 1 or 2 inches. So it's still a very active lift. You're not just passively hanging out at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Work that for 2 weeks, and then work on the concentric, coming up as fast as you can. Then almost all of his lifters hit like new PRs, 1 to 3 weeks after that, because it is a pretty intense phase depending upon how conditioned they are, etc. And then that performance also transferred to the field. So those athletes now who weren't as good athletes, who had that more kind of U looking shape, had a much sharper V looking shape. Not only did they get faster on the lifts, their limit strength went up, and their performance on the field actually went up at the same time. So that was kind of the basic of the triphasic training.
This is one of those things where I need to highlight that, like, this is all being done simply by inference. It's
Oh,
like,
100%. Yeah. I mean, he
yeah,
had $50,000 force plates, but it's just, hey, I think this is right. Let me test this. Let me take the athletes who are better, who are worse. What's the difference? Oh, here's the difference. Cool. We found that. Ooh, how do we train it? And the first bunch of different stuff he tried, like, didn't really work. It wasn't until he did the eccentric phase first and had the order correct that he saw the biggest results from it.
what do you think was the contributing factor to the eccentric component being done first?
I think it's, I think the eccentric component allows you to do the other phases better. And it may be that it's debatable if that or the isometric's the most stressful. I would argue physiologically the eccentric is probably the most stressful. Like if you go heavy and you go slow, like you're actually probably tearing the actin and myosin heads apart. Like you're
Yeah.
actively ripping some shit in there. And the body's going to come back and make that a little bit stronger. And when that eccentric phase is stronger, that allows you that deceleration component. And if you look at a lot of young athletes with change of direction, so a
Hmm.
big mistake I made early on was, oh, they just don't know the form. Like they don't know what they're doing. So if I know the right cues and I maybe use external cues instead of internal cues and I figure out all the mechanics, like they'll be able to do this. Some were, but a lot of them weren't. And I realized, oh, they're just weak in the eccentric component. Like they know
Well,
what to do. They just physically don't have the strength at a fast enough speed to be able to do it. They can't stop their body going one direction and come back that other direction. And I think that eccentric component is a huge part of that in almost all movements.
yeah, I mean, one of the axioms of explosive power is you have to be able to yield against or absorb force before you can apply force.
Yep.
So when I'm listening to the order of operations, like, yeah, it makes sense that eccentric would be the first phase. Um, Isometric to me, truthfully, complete like personal bias, I never really gave a shit about the isometric phase of anything until I got hurt.
Mm.
And then I realized the true power of training isometrics very hard. And not to mention how incredibly stressful isometrics are.
Oh, they're fucking horrible to do if you're doing them right.
Yeah, especially if there's a ton of force put into that. I remember the first isometric session I did. It was just like, 2 sets of 60-second holds at probably 30% effort or below pain threshold.
Oh
I
God.
remember for the
Ugh.
rest of the day, I was exhausted. I'm like, what the fuck just
Yeah.
happened to me? I feel like I hit by a truck. But when I saw the carryover to range of motion, to control, to the ability to exert force, then in reciprocity, I was sold. All of my clients now are doing some form of isometric training at any point in their training year. I myself included as well. But one thing that I've always placed a tremendous emphasis on in my training is rate of force development,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's compensatory acceleration training a la Fred Hatfield, or it was jumps, throws. I would hesitate to say Olympic weightlifting because I wasn't really sold on that. Um, and I saw tremendous carryover. It seems to be a bit against the grain to then pull that away from an athlete and make them train with a heavy eccentric first.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, like, maybe this is a question for strength coach Mike T. Is there pushback when you take away that rate of force development piece and focus purely on eccentric or isometric strength?
In my limited experience, yes, depends on the athlete population.
Okay.
The populations where I've had pushback have been very heavy on exactly what you said. Like, hey, our whole training style, our whole system, our whole motto is that we always push concentric faster. And
Right.
usually, how I would argue is like, hey, that's cool. Like, I 100% agree with that. But then I would ask them, one, are you actually physically getting better? Because what I've seen is athletes who haven't done that before, they add that to their training. Will they get better? 100%.
Right.
They definitely will. But at some point, whether it's year 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, they'll kind of cap out. Where
Yeah.
no matter how much more they're doing, no matter how much harder they're pushing, you can get into velocity based training, whatever. All those things are great. Like, and they definitely have their place. But I've just seen that a lot of athletes will just kind of cap out. And then you'll ask them, like, how is your performance on the field? It doesn't feel like it's transferring like it used to.
Yeah.
So my argument then is, well, maybe you've kind of maxed out that system in terms of where you're at. Maybe it is the eccentric component. Maybe you need to upgrade your actual physical hardware, to be a little bit bigger, stronger, get that isometric phase in place, and those are probably your rate limiters now. And if you
One
take some of those athletes and you have them do a slow eccentric, or you put them in some heinous isometric positions, even for four to
heinous.
six seconds, they they kind of crumble like a house of cards.
Uh,
And it's not their fault. It's just they haven't trained in those positions, right? It goes back to specificity.
yeah.
And usually then they're like, "Oh shit, you're right. Okay, let's try this."
Well, I think too with the isometric stuff, I think people forget that there's a transfer of training 15 degrees above and below. So it's like,
Yes.
yeah, you're training isometric at this point, but you're also gaining strength above and below. Like that's super valuable. The other piece that I was going to bring up was one of the critiques of triphasic, and I was personally, when it came out, I was like, I mean, this is probably good for people who are really good lifters, but the majority of our collegiate athlete population, or we'll say younger lifter, to me didn't have the requisite level of skill to train with a triphasic model. And I was like, do they really need it? Because if I just put them in the corner and jerk off, they'll get stronger. So why do I need this fancy protocol? Um, but the more I dove into it, if you're training the eccentric component really hard, well, then you're gaining that motor control. That motor learning will come a lot faster. And then if you're training the isometric, well, then you're going to get better proprioception in those end ranges. And then if you transition it all together into that concentric phase, now you're tying everything together. So you could even use the system to teach better movement. And then maybe you expedite progress. Is that part of the process?
Yeah, I would agree. It's very limited, but there's some very interesting motor learning research where doing the eccentric component only appears to transfer quite a bit to learning whatever that movement was. And this was done in a rehab setting. This was done for lifting. I wouldn't say it's the most well controlled studies. I'd have to go back and try to find a couple of them right now. But when I was more training people in my garage here in person, I was talking to Cal about this, and I had the same thing. I was like, yeah, but I'm not, at that point, I was training more general population, whoever I could get to pay my bills type thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, this sounds great, but He's like, well, just emphasize the eccentric component and then watch the progress of your lifting and form. I was like, okay. So I took a bunch of lifters and I just did 6-second eccentrics, and they
Ugh.
hated it. It was brutal,
Yeah.
but it was crazy how much that cleaned up their form without me overcoaching them.
Yeah.
And that's when I was kind of like, oh. And even now, like if I have still some general population and some other trainers that I work with online, I do what I kind of call bastardized triphasic training, and I just kind of bake it into all their programs at some point.
Yep.
Like we may do a lot of tempo work for a 6-second eccentric, a pause at the bottom, and then a fast concentric on. Lately, I've been doing it on hack squats, which is fucking horrible.
It's pretty much
Um,
all my hack squatting these days.
yep. But they have nowhere else to go. If they have the mobility to pull it off, like it's hard for them to compensate.
Mhm.
But it's also amazing how much better they learn the lift. And then also being online, you always get nervous about what does it look like when they're not sending you videos and that kind of stuff. Some clients,
Mhm.
most clients I have now are actually super good. But back like 10 years ago, like I probably didn't trust half those people with half the shit they were doing. So if I just said do a 6-second eccentric, I knew at least they're controlling that portion.
Right.
And then when I got video, I was shocked that like the rest of the reps looked pretty good.
Yeah.
So I may kind of bake that into their program now, more for control, but also for it just seems like it speeds up that motor learning process. So I think you can do that
Yeah.
in a high school situation. You can do it with people that are not super experienced. We kind of already know this, right? As trainers, like, what do you do? Like, if someone is looking like a flopping fish, like the first thing you're going to do is probably just slow that movement down entirely.
Yeah. I always looked at eccentric training as kind of gives the athlete the ability to self-correct
Yes.
because you're slowing down within positions that you may be compromised. So it forces you, like, say you have an issue with foot pressure. Well, if you're taking longer to go through those ranges of motion, you're going to feel where your feet have pressure. You're going to be able to self correct. Okay, I'm too far on my toes. I need to push back a little bit more to be on my midfoot. Okay, everything's even. Okay, in the bottom, I'm again pushing forward. My bar path is forward. I can self correct. And you do that enough times, all of a sudden everything gets cleaned up. So I'm the same way. Like I will put in usually a lot of the assistance work that I'll do with my clients is
Sure.
has some form of tempo and pause just for that proprioception and neuromuscular control, and it transfers very quickly to the main lift. It doesn't even have to be hyper specific either. Like as you mentioned, like a hack squat, that externally stabilized squatting pattern will absolutely transfer over to a barbell squat.
Yeah, and if I'm thinking about online environment, I'm also thinking about what is the skill level of the person, what is the risk reward. I mean, if they're training for power lifter, I do have some power lifters and CrossFit athletes and stuff like that. Yeah, whatever. I don't really worry about them. They're probably pretty good with it. But if if someone's new, they've never really back squatted before, their goal is to add some performance, gain some muscle, get a little bit better conditioned. I rarely ever have them back squat. Maybe front squat or Zercher, maybe.
Yeah,
But risk reward, if I'm not there and the amount of time it's going to take me to get them decent, and their external rotation, their elbows is shit, like their movement isn't so good. It's like, yeah, it's just, I it made my life easier by not worrying about it.
well, I think this brings back to like movements are just tools. Like
Yeah.
they're just tools to get a job done. So we go through triphasic, and obviously so much was learned during the process of both researching and writing the first book. You mentioned 14 new methods. I mean, I don't want to go through all 14, but maybe what are some of the really big rocks that came to light during the research for the second book and writing the second book?
Yeah, the issue was trying to put it in a complete system, because all of these sort of subsystems and programs that Cal came up with sort of evolved on their own over like 12 years. And if you were to be in his facility and watch his athletes go through a 17 or 23 station, lifting thing, it just looks completely wacky and overwhelming. Right? It looks like, oh my God, I don't understand what any of this stuff is. It's almost like a foreign language.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, so how do we take all these different systems, subsystems, and put them in. Because when I think of getting a book, I think of this is the best of the best. This is the distilled knowledge, but I want it in a way that people can open it and like apply it right away
Yep.
instead of like, I mean, yeah, we could have just, written out all the programs he has and explained why we do each thing. But I didn't feel that was for coaches education super beneficial. So the thing that took the longest was to figure out, okay, how do you put all this stuff in a system that makes sense? And so what
Okay.
we ended up doing is we ended up putting it in as turn on, train, and transfer. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of alliteration. And I'm like, hey, it's triphasic. As many things in threes, like all the better, right? We can just beat the crap out of triphasic in multiple directions then. So that made me happy. So the turn on is like, what do you do for warm-ups? Because the stuff he does for warm-ups is unique. So primarily it's, RPR, reflexive performance reset, which we can circle back to. What he calls the GOAT drill, which the first time he showed this to me, I literally thought, okay, he's completely lost his mind at this point. It's imagine an athlete doing a figure eight while they're staring at one spot. So their head is never turning. They're passing a ball around their waist and they're counting backwards from 100 by like a prime number, like 3 or 7. And that's
What?
the easy version. Exactly. So you've got two hula hoops on the ground. You're running a figure eight. You're always watching one spot. So at some point, right, you're turning and twisting to keep your head looking at the same position all the time.
Okay.
You're passing a tennis ball around your waist, and then you're counting backwards out loud by prime numbers. And the first time he showed this to me, I was like, what the hell are you doing? This is this most screwed up, bizarro thing I've ever seen in my life. And then he explained it to me and like some of the results he was seeing. And I started thinking about it. I'm like, oh, so it's a warm up. So you're getting coordination of the visual system, vestibular system, proprioceptive system. You've got a cognitive demand. Like, so you've got dual tasking. You've got some of the infinity movement in there. I was like, okay, this kind of makes sense. Exactly.
What the fuck?
Yeah, that was my first. I still remember I was in the lab. I was doing my PhD. He comes over because his, where he was is literally right next. We're both in the same building. The exercise phys lab was, I could walk to his office when I was at the U of M in 30 seconds, if that, if I was slow and then hungover. He comes over one day in between labs. He shows me this on his phone. And I'm like, I looked at him and I went, what the hell are you doing? I told him, I think I might have told him, like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. But after a while, I was like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. And then playing around with it, having different athletes do it. And yeah, so that's part of the warm up. And the goal there is to sort of get everything coordinated. But if you think back to like high level athletics, you have to have almost all of those things kind of unlocked. Like you're not thinking about where's my feet, where's my hands,
Right.
where should I put my eyes? If you're doing that, like the other guy just beat you, right? So all that has to be functioning at a pretty high level at an unconscious rate.
For the
Yeah, that was pretty
record,
crazy.
I'm going to title this podcast "This Kind of Makes Sense." All right,
Yeah.
so we got turn on, then we got train.
Yeah. So training is a lot of the newer methods. So the main method there is something that's the supermax method, and the exercise use has also changed over time. And so what he realized with some of his more advanced athletes was, okay, I probably need to apply more eccentric stress. Okay, I probably need to go over 100% of what they can come back up with, right? Because we know you're stronger eccentrically than you are concentrically. So maybe even as high as 110, 120% of their 1RM. But putting athletes who are not super experienced in a back squat, he's like, yikes, that's scary.
Yeah.
And so he came up with using like a yoke bar and doing it in a split stance. So he allowed people to hold on for balance because like it's not a balance drill. Now the way to support it, obviously it's done in a rack. You've got spotters, and it's more of a split stance. So now you're loading one leg preferentially.
So like a B stance or like a legitimate split squat?
Like a pretty heavy split squat, but
Okay.
both feet are on the floor. Like you're
Okay.
not raising the other one back.
Okay. Gotcha.
Um, I guess he tried that, because there was that big craze for a while that Mike Boyle hated back squats and everyone was doing, rear foot elevated split squats. And what no one really tells you, of anyone who ran that experiment and went pretty heavy, like you had a lot of groin SI issues.
Oh, I tore my rec fem doing heavy Bulgarians back in the day.
Oh, yep, there's
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah.
So he's like, yeah, that risk reward isn't really there. And he's like, there's too much of also when you go heavy, a balance component that's just not needed, that's going to limit some of the loading.
Right.
So it's a split stance. And initially he had both on the balls of both feet. And then later, after he did a bunch of foot and ankle stuff, he's like, you can probably keep your feet flat. Because the rationale was most athletes are playing, off of the ball of their foot. And by doing that, he was able to go up to, 110, 120% of a 1RM on the eccentric phase, and even have some of his female athletes doing, very heavy isometrics in that position after a while. Again, it
Okay.
looks bonkers when the first time I saw that one, I was like, on one hand, I'm like, that's genius because it is a very safe position you can load. And because of the split stance, you do get that more kind of unilateral type load.
Hmm.
Um, but I remember him saying, like, he had some of his throwers, I think doing ISOs in the 700 plus pound range or something crazy. Um, but the more you think about it, I'm like, at some point, if you have pretty advanced athletes, you just need some way of getting a heavier load to get that next level of adaptation. Again, this is not where you would start with new athletes.
Wait a second. So you're doing a split stance with over 100% of a back squat?
No, it'll be 100% of loading for that particular lift. Like it's just
Okay. All right. That
there's
makes more sense
yeah,
to me.
there's a he has an equation that'll transfer it from what your back squat is and that kind of stuff. So,
I love
yeah,
love
the
love
point
a good
is that
equation.
yeah, you're able to lower more than you can concentrically go.
Of course.
So because of that, we're going to load the eccentric component heavier than what you normally would.
And how do you get it back up? The spotters lift it back up?
Spotters can lift it back up. Like so if you're doing a real heavy eccentric phase,
Mm.
yeah, don't worry about it. You're just your goal is just to do the eccentric component anyway. Now again, if you're doing multiple reps or things like that, or you're training by yourself, there's different ways you can kind of work around that.
One of the things that jumped out to me is like I've always been of the mind, especially after reading like, Zetsorsky and Mel Sif, that anything over about 110% of 1RM, you're not really getting much dynamic correspondence. He found going over and above that to be beneficial.
In advanced people, yes. But
Okay.
again, that's dropped into the triphasic template again. So you're going to do that as a heavy eccentric component. So we're just emphasizing the eccentric. Now we're going to put you in that bottom position. You're going to do that for an ISO, and then you're going to do that as a concentric. So again, it's taking those components and training them heavier and more specific.
You mentioned earlier on in our conversation, you kind of glanced over it, but you mentioned something along the lines of like abbreviating the system. So
Hmm.
is that part of the second book, like the abbreviating this method?
Yeah, there was, I think he calls it the compressed triphasic method. So in the first book, he had I'd say more longer protracted version that had like GPP and aerobic stuff first, because one of the issues he ran into with lower level athletes when you just drop them into triphasic, the amount of stress that you would need to impose to get the good adaptations, their system just couldn't handle it. And he realized that it was the aerobic system that was the main limiter there. So he would run, a 2 to 3 to maybe 4 week GPP aerobic type block first. And then if your athletes aren't as trained, you may run eccentrics for 3 weeks and you may have to give them a week off at that point and then come
Mm.
back and do isometric. And so it's basically just titrating based on the stress levels. And again, some people can also then do, hey, like we're bought in, we're gonna do fucking eccentrics Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and beat the shit out of them and do 2 weeks. Other people are like, well, we can't really do that. We can only do heavy eccentrics 1 day a week or 2 days a week. So again, your frequency of how often you're gonna do it will also determine how long you can run those blocks then for too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, just like anything else, the more frequent and more intense you go, even in highly trained athletes, you can't run that forever. It's going to be a limited thing.
So we got Supermax, we've got compressing the model. What are some other methods that have come out of this?
I have to look because
he's referencing the book.
I'm
Everybody.
referencing the book because I always get confused
This
about
is an
which ones we
open book
actually had.
exam.
Yeah, open book exam, which is good. There's a bunch of other ones we dropped in that are more on the. So I would say the other big one. I'm trying to think about. So
Yeah,
two things. The other big one is the aerobic system, which we'll come to, and the other one is how do you do periodization, right? So if you think about the most simplistic way to do periodization for an athlete, I think most people would say train some power, train some speed, train some strength, right? I would say if you think simply, those are probably the three phases you want to do. Then the question is,
fair.
how much strength? How much speed? How much power? Like, how long do we run these for?
Yeah.
And what he realized was that you could use vertical jump, you could play around with all these other different things, but he ended up putting a bunch of numbers into basically just and categorizing it by sprint distance. So you would time their sprint to, I think it's a 20-yard sprint, and then you would time from 0 to 10 yards and then 10 yards to 20. So if you've got the whole sprint there, you've got both times. And you plug that into, it's called the Pro Performance Optimizer, which is free on the website. And it'll spit out, you need to work on strength, or you need to work on speed, or you need to work on power. So what he ended up doing was he just ran 2-week blocks. Let's say arbitrarily you put the number in, it says start on strength. Great. Run strength block for 2 weeks, retest. Oh, it says I still need strength. Okay. Work on strength again. Test it. Oh, okay. Now it says I need power. Great. And so what he found was that was pretty able to predict like really, really good results. And I think he even went back and took like a bunch of results from the combine and a bunch of other things, and it all matched up pretty good.
Mm.
It kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? Because they're all related to each other. Like you may not be able to train a speed phase just because you're just weak, right?
Right.
Like his new athletes would do multiple phases of strength. He's like, they're just not strong enough to go fast. But at some point, you can't just train fast all the time because you're going to be missing power. And maybe at some point, you're going to be missing strength again. So you're kind of always oscillating between all of these. Or if you walk in with an athlete that's super strong, super powerful, but not real fast, they're probably going to go work more on speed. So it's an easy way for anyone who can set it up and just time their 20-yard dash to just every 2 weeks, just drop it in there, retest them, and then now you automatically have like an automatic periodization of where they need to work on.
I think it's really important that you highlighted the test retest model because
Yes.
it's so important to have these indicators within your program to know if you're running the right program. You mentioned aerobic. So this is something that I have yelled from the rooftops for years that you would get stronger if you were just simply in better shape. And
Oh, yeah.
when you look at it objectively, like Cole's notes, if I am more aerobically fit, I will recover faster between sets. I will recover faster between exercises. I will recover faster between training sessions. And I will actually be able to recover faster in between repetitions so that I can take those sets harder and longer and provide a greater stimulus. So you're getting better stimulus, you're getting better recovery, you're getting better adaptation. Why in the fuck are you a fat piece of shit? Expand.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying the same. I have a whole program coming out. It's just aerobic training for meatheads, and I like years ago, like so personally, God, this probably goes back. Yeah, it was like 2013. I was just doing some powerlifting, was never very good at it at all by any stretch of the imagination. but I kind of read too much into the interference literature and probably followed a little too many power lifters at that time too closely who just said, aerobics are just rubbish. And you would email them and you're like, oh, you're 6'4", you only weigh 240. Like, you fuck aerobics, just lift harder, like, eat more. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And the idiot me is like, okay, sure, whatever. Not knowing that I started lifting at 156 pounds. And I remember going to work. I was working at a biomedical engineering place, and I had my backpack and my cooler, and literally walked up the top of the second flight of stairs. And I almost had to stop and set my cooler down. I was so out of breath. And I remember thinking, what the F am I doing?
Yep. I've
Like,
had
this
moments like that.
feels horrible. And so then I went back and started looking at all my numbers. And I'm like, okay, what happened during this time period where I ran this experiment for about 2 years? I didn't really get any stronger than what I was before.
Yeah.
I found that I couldn't lift as much. I got way fatter for sure. And I felt horrible. Like, I was sleeping, 10, 11 hours a night just to feel like a normal human being. And I realized, I'm like, these are not even remotely competitive numbers to begin with. They're not even that far off of my best compared to me personally.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, this is stupid. So kind of went away from that. And then it was probably 3 years, 4 years after that. I was talking to my buddy, Dr. Kenneth J, and we're just comparing notes. And he did a whole course on aerobic stuff. I got big into using the rower through him and a bunch of other stuff. And I realized that, oh my God, like, if your aerobic base is better, like, you just feel so much better.
Yeah.
Like, just everything is easier. Recovery is easier. Like you said, like, I can train more. I don't get demolished. I don't need to wait 10 minutes between, sets of doubles or whatever. And it was, it's kind of one of those things where you almost like want to, put your head through a wall and look back and go, I knew all this stuff. I mean, I got beat over the head with all the aerobic stuff, in college. It wasn't like
Yeah.
I didn't know it. I just didn't apply it and just thought there must be some magic to this interference effect. And I went too far down that rabbit hole to my detriment.
I remember I was in grad school and I was talking to Bill Campbell and I was like, Bill, if this interference effect is real, if I was an Olympic level sprinter, why wouldn't I just spend the rest of my life other than sprinting in a wheelchair? And he was like, oh, well, you don't want to do that. I'm like, why? And he couldn't really
Yeah.
give me an answer. And it wasn't until I dove into things that I was like, okay, well, this doesn't make sense. I'm sure there's interference effect absolutely does exist.
Oh, of course.
But then the question becomes, how much? Like, how much would you actually have to do to impact the amount of adaptation that you could get in one system versus another? And I think it's a lot.
It's a lot. Like, the first study that really looked at that, which you probably are familiar with, was Hickson.
Yep.
So Hickson was this, physiologist who was really big into running, aerobic stuff. And I mean, the history of exercise physiology is primarily aerobic based, just because we had treadmills and then we had Douglas bags and we had metabolic carts. And it was just easy to measure that stuff in the lab. It was much, much harder to measure lifting. We just didn't have the equipment like we have now. And I can't remember the details of the study, but he basically beat the ever living shit out of people with aerobics and lifting. And he did find that there was an interference effect. But follow up studies at lesser volumes show that not really. And then if you get in the weeds, like, the biggest effect is usually on speed and power. So there is some studies, and this one study was done in females where they took moderate level trained females, trained them, and then they had one group that didn't do any aerobic stuff. I think it was 6 weeks. They had another group that did 40 minutes of moderate aerobic stuff immediately after their weight training sessions.
Okay.
And in the group that did the moderately aerobic training immediately after weight training, they didn't really lose any muscle mass. Like, their strength was a little lower, but it wasn't horribly lower. But they did lose vertical jump. So they did lose speed and power. So if you're a really high level athlete, do I still want them doing moderate aerobic stuff after their speed and power stuff? No.
Probably
But I'm
not.
just going to move it to a different part of the day, or we're going to move it to a different block. It doesn't mean we're not going to do it. I think that's where people forget that, like, if you're doing it on separate days and if it's separated, the amount of volume you have to accumulate in both of those is very high. Like, most
Absolutely.
people will not run into that amount of volume. Like, it's possible, but extremely unlikely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You alluded to something earlier that I think is worth mentioning. You mentioned as part of the turn on using something called RPR or reflexive performance reset. Why do you want to touch people?
The cool part with RPR is like you can teach them how to do it on themselves, which is great.
So you teach other people how to touch themselves. Okay, got it.
Yep. Also looks batshit crazy. Like if there's a theme of anything. Um, I mean, I remember the first time. Again, I was in the lab at the U. Cal comes over. He's like, "Hey, man, I got this guy. We're flying him in from South Africa. He's gonna do this certification in 2 days in June. This is like January."
Mm-hmm.
I was like, "Oh, okay. Like, what is it on?" He's like, "Crazy shit, man. Crazy shit." I'm like, okay. Like, how much is this crazy cert? It's like, oh, it's $1,500. You gotta go, man. You gotta go. And if it was anyone else on the face of the planet, I'd be like, screw you. I'm not paying $1,500 to learn from God knows your shaman you're flying in from South Africa or whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm like, okay, man, whatever. Okay, cool. So fast forward, I'm doing my PhD. I can barely know what day of the week it is. So we're presenting at PaleoFX in Texas in March, I think, or
Mm-hmm.
April. And I'm sitting next to Cal at the speaker dinner because we're both presenting. And I asked Cal, I said, hey, man, what's this like cert I'm paying you $1,500 for in June? Like, I've been so busy, I haven't had any time to, do anything with it or look at it. He's like, oh, man, stand up, stand up. So we're at the speaker dinner. We stand up and he takes his thumb and sticks it between the right side of your rib cage, between that bottom pointy part of your rib cage and the top pointy part of your hip, like your
Mm-hmm.
ASIS,
Yep.
and just gives you like this side noogie of death with his other arm around me. And I'm like screaming and he's just sitting there going, ah! Everybody like puts their forks down, stops, like looks at us and are looking at us like, what the fuck are you two doing? We sit down and he's like, crazy shit, man, crazy shit. I'm like, Cal, you didn't tell me anything about what this is other
Yeah.
than I know this is going to be incredibly painful. And he's like, oh man, you'll love it. You'll love it. I'm like, oh my God, why did I sign up? What am I doing with my life? Like, this is insane. So we get to the cert, and it turns out the cert was Doug Keel, who runs Be Activated Training.
Mm-hmm.
And he had him condense his level 1 and level 2 from 4 days into 2 days. And long story short, it was actually super beneficial. And I was like, wow, I think there's something here, but I still wasn't convinced. So I'm like, okay. So I said, I called everyone around I could find, like, who's the most expensive soft tissue person I can find? There's some guy doing ART that was like 250 to 200 a session. So I'm like, great, I'm going to do 250 a session. And I gathered up a bunch of people and I said, okay, the first 30 people I do, after that, it's going to be 250 a session. But if you come in and I'll do it for free. So I gave him a number, like you're 11, you're 13, you're 14, because I wanted him to show up. And all I did was RPR on him. And I was shocked at like how effective it actually was. Because even at that point, I still didn't really quite believe that you're working on something like the back of their head is what's going to turn on their glute max. I'm like, I don't know. This seems kind of weird. But
Mm-hmm.
when I tested it, it seemed to work. And it actually, the crazy part was it seemed to hold up under load, which previous to that point, I had spent $30,000 probably learning soft tissue stuff and doing all sorts of different systems. And I got to be pretty good on a table, but unfortunately, a year and a half into that, people kept coming back. I'm like, hey, we fixed you, air quotes, fixed you. Why are you coming back? And I realized that, oops, I should probably have him stand up and walk around the table and lay back down. And when I started doing that, even the effect of gravity, like everything I did, like I got no result at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, oh shit. So I started testing everything and I couldn't find anything that would hold up under load. And so I stopped doing all soft tissue work for probably like 3 years because I was just like, it's all bullshit. Like none of it works. Like, yeah, you can be a wizard on the table, but none of this transfers to the weight room. Like, show me the freaks, show me the difference. And so that actually held up under load. And then, yeah, I ended up teaching RPR for quite a few years before COVID. And it's a system where you can work on yourself in different locations to get better recruitment of the muscle itself and actually change the order so that the order is a better recruitment order. And that's the part that people forget. So a lot of high-level track athletes, they usually have a lot of hamstring issues.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch a lot of the gait patterns and what they're doing, the hamstring is firing first before the glute max.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still loading the glute max. It's not like your glute max is not working, but the hamstring is firing first. So if you can change that recruitment to same side glute max, same side hamstring, opposite side QL, not only will they run faster, you've reduced their risk of injury. So it's
And
also changing that recruitment pattern.
and you're doing all of this by applying, we'll call it rhythmic pressure to certain areas of the body that are correlated with these neural pathways.
Yeah, and so every time I've done both the training from Cal and Doug, and so for fun now, if I ever do the training through Doug, I just ask him like, "Hey, how did you come up with the system?" And the last time I did the level 2 stuff with him, it was probably 6 years ago. He gave the class some story about him drinking tequila in the desert for 40 days, and he came up with them then. And he just gives you some BS story that doesn't really mean anything. But what you realize is that some of them are Chapman's reflexes, which there
Mm-hmm.
is some data on that, not a ton. Some of them are acupressure sites. Some of them are just simple origin insertion. Some of them are from like neuroembryology and development. So the
Okay.
one behind your head, where your skull comes up at the base, when kids are learning to develop basically hip extension, their head is down, but they have to raise their head up as their leg is cycling behind them. So there's a neurologic connection between the neck extensors and your hip extensors. And it turns out that that neurologic connection is a two-way street, not a one-way street. Meaning working on these back here reflexively gets your glute max to work better because of that innate reflex. So there's some stuff like that too.
That's actually really funny because one of my favorite cues for improving someone's ability to control their pelvis in the bottom of a squat is to retract the chin.
Yep.
And I was like, and I just thought of it as like, changing your center of mass and, that sort of stuff. But it makes total sense that if there's a neural connection between cervical retraction and those like upper spinal stabilizers and glute max, totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, and there's some other weird stuff with that too of I don't know why, but like doing positions like that for a lot of people, the theory is may air quotes impinge the nerves and kind of result in some weird stuff. I used to do this all the time. So I would take the athlete out of the squat rack, have their neck back, and then just do a manual hamstring test. And most of
Mm-hmm.
the time it's like whoop, nothing. Like put their neck straight, pull their chin back. Whoop, hamstring is really good. Just to kind of show them that, and you could see in their form, right? They
Yeah.
would get stuck, their head goes back like this, and like everything just goes to shit.
Yeah. Talk to me about the transfer part. So we talked about, RPR turn on. We talked a little bit about the different modalities that have evolved in the train portion. How does the transfer portion change from triphasic 1 to triphasic 2?
Yeah. And then in the training part, as we talked about, there's a huge aerobic stuff. Like, I mean, a third of the book is probably just
Oh, wow.
different aerobic methods too. So there's a
Okay.
ton of aerobic stuff. So if people are interested in that, there's a ton of stuff in there. The transfer, I think, is the most interesting part
Okay.
because it's getting better. But the general assumption, especially even 5 years ago, was if I just make athletes bigger and stronger, they'll perform better. And to some degree, that's actually true.
Yeah.
But I always used to go around and I'd always ask coaches and I'd be like, hey, your best athletes in the weight room, are they your best athletes on the field?
Never.
And almost all the time they'd be like, no. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird, isn't it? And again, it's not to say that strength training isn't helpful, but I'm like, there's more to it than just making them bigger and stronger. And so the transfer section is looking at, okay, how do you get performance to transfer from the weight room to the field? Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And there's things like, for example, width of lifts you're doing. So let's say you're going to train your hamstrings and you're going to do an RDL, great exercise.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in the speed, power, or strength phase, the width of your stance would vary to get better transfer. So if you want more strength, you would be wider, which makes sense, right? Take an example, extreme example of powerlifting. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Powerlifting in general, you're going super wide. Part of that is mechanics. You're trying to reduce the range of motion, all that kind of stuff. But everybody knows that if you're wider as compared to real narrow, in general, you're going to be stronger.
Mm-hmm.
But if you would look at power, you're going to be a little bit more narrow. And then speed, if you look at top end speed, like most of the foot strikes and everything are directly underneath the hip.
Right.
So for speed, you would then move your stance in a little bit more narrow. Again, your goal isn't to lift the most amount of weight in a speed phase, it's to get that speed of contraction and to get that thing to transfer to the speed on the field. So something as simple as playing with stance whip and making that specific to the phase you're in will increase your ability to transfer that.
That makes a ton of fucking sense.
Yeah, I
So,
know. And I saw that. I was like, oh shit, that's brilliant.
well, it's keeping with our theme. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so now that you've gone through, you've written this book, 14 new methods, how has the process of writing the book changed your approach to training the clients that you work with?
I mean, I think it kind of gave me a better appreciation that I can probably push the envelope more than what I am currently. That there's probably things, for athletes that for transfer and for things like that, I can drop in to be more specific for them.
Mm-hmm.
I have included like the goat drill that's been pretty beneficial for athletes. Online, it's a little bit of a harder sell. Side note, if you do that with a fat grip at Lifetime, which I've done recently, they look at you like you're even more batshit crazy than what you normally are if you go to a
Bro,
commercial
if I
gym.
saw you at at 6'4", shuffling around a hula hoop, I would probably call the police and say, "Hey, yo, there's a fucking meth head in our gym right now."
Yeah. What's going on?
Oh
He's
my
wearing some black metal shirt that I can't even read the writing on it
god.
too. What the fuck?
I love it, man, and I'm really glad that you're able to come on and talk about this because I think a lot of the conversations that I have on the podcast steer away from X's and O's, but the X's and O's is something that I do want to start coming back to more often, just to highlight number one the differences in what people are doing, but also to highlight the similarities and parallels that can be drawn. And I think from this book, there are so many things that they reaffirm the critical thoughts that we've had in the past, but maybe shied away from implementing because they went counter to what the research said. But sometimes you just kind of know.
Yeah, and like you said, like the biggest thing is just testing. Like I think
Mm-hmm.
I told you the story before of a buddy of mine. He got kicked off a popular forum about 15 years ago, debating, when you start a sprint, should you do a false step backwards or a plyo step, or you just fall forward? Like a lot of the people at that time were like, no, you just fall forward. And so he kept putting up his testing with his athletes, testing a plyo step versus falling forward. And the plyo step was like faster every single time. And so each day he would he would go into the forum. He's like, tested another athlete, looks like plyo step one again. And he would post the video of him actually like legitimately doing this. And it was bonkers to see how much hate he got for that. And I'm like, well, show us your test. And he was very open about it. He's like, I'm not trying to be a dickhead here. He's like, if there's another method that's better, like by all means, like someone please tell me what it is and tell me what you found.
Right.
But it was so weird, like how much objection there was to them and these are all people who run a facility who supposedly train athletes who could very easily do this at a drop of a hat.
Mm-hmm.
Not a single one of them posted any video. Like they were just so afraid that they might be wrong. And I'm just like, your athletes don't know. They don't care. They're paying you to get a result. They're
Yeah.
not paying you for your ego and all this other weird shit that it was bizarre.
So obviously inherent with, the work that you do, the education, and the teaching, there is an element of seeking to be proven wrong. What allows you, I think I'm trying to word this question properly, because I think you and I both resonate on the fact that like we're actively seeking to be proven wrong, right? Like
Yeah.
we're actively seeking to have our ideas challenged because it's the only way we're going to learn. But at some point, does ego come into play here?
I think it always does. I mean, it's just part of being a human. I mean, I remember even reading, shit, a couple months ago, a study that looked at, I think it was intermittent fasting did not increase metabolic flexibility in humans. And I saw the title and went, oh, cool, I got to read that. And honestly, my first thought was, shit, what if I've been wrong this whole time? And it was a thing of like, ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I want to read it, but I'm like, no, but I want to find out if it has been wrong. Like, I want to know the new data. I want to know what's going on. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think there is always that element. It's just, do you allow it to sort of stay unchecked? Like, does that prevent you from doing the thing and asking the questions?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, because at the end of the day, I feel like, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Like, I have an obligation to the people I work with and train and teach that I'm doing the best I can to figure out what is, air quotes, the real answer.
Right.
And at some point, does that cost you money in terms of business? Yeah, but I think long term it pays off for itself,
Oh,
because
without
otherwise
question.
you just get stuck into one area and you can never get out, and you evolve your whole business to be, keto for fat loss or conjugate for life, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And even within some training systems, there's maybe enough flexibility to allow you to do that. But systems that are incredibly rigid, like, I'm just picking on keto because it's like, oh, carbs are evil. If that's like your whole shtick, like, maybe in some areas it's great. And I think that's true. But for other areas, like for speed and power and athletic development, no, don't do a keto diet. That's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's your whole thing and that's your whole business model, it's very hard to change and question that, because you're literally questioning your own security at that time. And so I think that's, try not to. So I've been very, I guess, cautious, maybe overly cautious, of trying not to pigeonhole myself into one whole area that I will subconsciously not want to change because it's impending and bad for my survival, I guess.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for me, I always look at. I just finished reading The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, so it's kind of top
Oh,
of
how is
top of
it? I've
mind.
heard it's good.
Dude, fantastic book. And it plays directly into what we're talking about, right? So you can't win at research. You cannot win at business. You cannot win at sports performance from a pedagogy standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at the goal of continued learning, the goal isn't to win at learning. The goal is not to be right or wrong. The goal is to find truth. And so if the cool thing about everything we've talked about is I personally don't believe that the truth exists. And in the sense of like training and nutrition,
Yeah.
because there's so much context involved and there's so much humanity involved in the process that
And redundancy.
and redundancy. So there is no truth to be found. There is a relative, we'll call it relative truth within certain situations. And if I don't have this robust baseline of knowledge, then I'm not going to be able to help the people that I'm working with. Um, so I try to put my ego aside in everything that I do. And I want to highlight that the people that I've had on the podcast all share that. I haven't had anyone on the podcast yet who's been like, no, I know everything. My way is the best way of doing things. And I also haven't had anyone on the podcast come on and say the exact same thing as someone else.
Yeah.
So I think even in that, it kind of proves the point that like we can all get results. We all have different ways to go about it. We all have rationales as to why we choose the methods that we do, but we're all also seeking to continue to grow and evolve.
Yeah. I mean, the only way you're going to do that is just by testing it. It's like
Yeah.
the old story of, the researcher who spends his whole life with this hypothesis that, all swans are white. So he spends 10 years, he's all over the globe, like documenting all these pictures of white swans. He's everywhere, all these other countries, wakes up one day and, some guy in southern Mississippi posts a picture of a black swan in his backyard and goes, "Hey, look, a black swan." It's like, oh, fuck. My whole hypothesis is shot by like one photo that showed up on the internet. Right?
Yeah,
So
it's so true.
he should have been looking to disprove his own hypothesis. Like he should have been looking for swans that are not white. That would have been a much more effective way to do it. But that goes back to the conversation we just had. Like
Yeah.
it's hard to want to try to disprove your own hypothesis, but in some way, that's the only way you're going to make measurable progress forward.
Couldn't have said it better myself, man. Thank you so much for joining me today, sharing, your knowledge and your evolution as a coach. Where can people find the book? I'll have linked to it, but where can they find it?
Yeah. So the best place is just the website. Go to www.triphasic2, so the number 2.com, and that'll route you directly to the book. We also have a newsletter there through Triphasic, which you can find. Hopefully, there will be up on that site also very soon.
Awesome. I love it. Since you're on the podcast for a second time, who's the next guest you're going to get for me?
Oh, I don't know. What are you looking for?
No, this is you. Like, who do you think I should interview?
Ooh. Can you give me an area or any questions you're trying to figure out, or just in general?
Listen, you told me last time you were gonna get me Andy Galpin, and you fucking flaked on it. So,
yeah, he hasn't done well. He only does big podcasts now.
I
know. Who would be a good? Actually, have you talked to James Lavelle?
I haven't. No.
I think he would be a good one. He's definitely more on the nutrition side.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm trying to think of someone who's like a bigger-ish name too. So
all right, you get me, James. Dude, thank you so much for joining me. It was a sincere pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. That was fun.
No
yeah,
problem.
Cool, man.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and we'll catch you on the next one.